All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the August 23rd, Wednesday Istio Ambient Contributors Meeting. So first up on the agenda is Kevin on service entry scope design. Kevin, go ahead and present.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's see. You should all see my screen now. Please let me know if you do not.
Yep, it's loading. Yep, it's there.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the service entry API kind of like tenancy models and potential, how this can impact users in perhaps undesirable ways. I guess the background right off the bat, this is kind of sprung about because there was some behavior in zTunnel that I noticed that I thought was a little bizarre, and I put up a PR to change it. And after a little discussion, it became clear this was probably worth a design doc and discussion. So I'd like to walk through kind of the thought process and the problem being solved, and then open up to discussion and how we want to handle this. So yeah, to jump into it, the real crux of the question is that I like to ask is, what does it mean to apply? Like, what does it mean to be a service entry, and who is it for? One concrete example is like, what happens if I apply two different service entries with the same host that conflict in two different namespaces? So this is a little bit contrived, but I do think it will end up mattering, and I'll show why as a user I might care. But just to ask some of the questions to frame what I'm thinking about. If I have these service entries, one, is this even valid, or how could we prevent this from being valid? And two, if it is valid and I make a query to conflictinghost.com, what do I get back? Do I get back both of these VIPs? Do I get a load balanced round robin random? Do I get one with a namespace preference? Like, what do I expect my request to actually do? And so a different way of asking the question that I want to ask is service entry like a namespace resource or a global one? And what are those trade-offs? Stop me there if that doesn't make any sense. If not, I can get into the user-facing implications. All of this part of the doc is just a refresher for like the actual definition of what we call a service entry, and none of it kind of hints at the globality or namespace nature of a service entry. I also just wanted to call out that if we have a conflict on hosts across like a kube service and a service entry, we merge them. But right now, today, if we have a conflict on two different service entries, we kind of bug out and take the older one. So there's a little consistency there. We also have the export to field, which can control the scope of a service entry, but I still think that this kind of holistically could be problematic. And so jumping into what I see as potentially an issue, the reason I care is, Istio has a little bit of a reputation of being, having foot guns or lack of proper and nice UX. And in this case, I think there's an unclear API owner, like who is the service entry for? And so one example of how this could be problematic is, let's say I'm a user and I have an application in the mesh that's going to google.com, and it's been going there for a long time. I'm in my namespace 1. Some random user in some namespace 2 adds a service entry for google.com, and this is inherited globally. So now my application, which used to go to google.com successfully, now goes to this like test VIP and hello world. This is true in Classic today as well, Classic Istio. And I'm bringing this discussion forward because I believe there's some appetite for change to API and ambient, and I'd like to make it better. But yes, so basically like a user in another namespace can go ahead and break my traffic, and there's nothing I can do to prevent them from doing that. And the crux of this is in my mind, thinking about this is, who is the persona that a service entry is for? Is it meant for any Istio user to like define their own hosts, and thus if it's done that way, is it scoped to their namespace? Is it only meant for admins, right? Should we even be allowing people to do this if they're not a mesh administrator? I don't think that's very realistic, the way that we see service entries used today, or some combination of both. Does the problem here that I'm calling out sort of make sense? Okay, I'm going to move forward as if that's a yes. So just going through some of the possible API semantics, this is the way that service entries work today for both classic and ambient. So we are consistent. Right now, service entry hosts are global. So that's why a user can go ahead and muck around with my existing host to Google. If there's a conflict, so if I were to create even duplicate hosts, for example, in classic Istio, we'll just knack the config and we'll get stuck until one of them is gone. In ambient, we have this behavior where we prefer our local namespace and otherwise randomly load balance. And this was the original behavior. I looked at this and I'm like, this is weird. Why are we doing this? And so I went about to change it, but then I thought about it more. And so that was this doc. The implementation we have today is kind of a weird middle ground for who owns this resource. It kind of says that service entries are for anyone in the mesh. But if they're global, it means like some more privileged user can set a fallback. They're not just for people within their namespaces. And so it's kind of challenging to say who owns this resource and who can break behavior and traffic across namespace boundaries. So one way we could go about rethinking what a service entry is, and I'll get it to the end of this doc to my concrete recommendations or thoughts here. And I'd love to field, thoughts at any point. Please stop me if you have questions or things you'd like to discuss in the middle. I'd love to keep things conversational. But so the next way we can think about this is service entry is global, and we've merged semantics. So instead of having this conflict where we take the older service entry, we could say that they're global. A service entry is a global host name, selects backend workloads. Each additional service entry would just be effectively adding more backends to that host name. So there's no special casing, there's no conflicts. We just merge everything. If we wanted to only use specific backends, we could use the VIP rather than load balancing across all the services. This implementation kind of assumes that service entries are really for admins, or they're shared, they're cluster global. And so if you really wanted to use your service, then you need to use the VIP because they're shared. The hosts are shared. I'm not a big fan of this, but it does, have a clear delineation of who owns this resource. It doesn't have this like awkward, shared model. Or kind of my favorite idea is like, let's change service entry and make it properly namespaced. It's the idea being that, it selects backend workloads in a namespace, and that host name is only reachable from within that namespace. If we want to export a service entry from behind a host to other namespaces, we have a variety of options, and I'd love to detail what those are. And they're not huge changes, but there are changes. But the default would be that they're not global, right? If someone came in and applied this resource, it would only affect namespace 2. It would not affect namespace 1, which is not the behavior today. I'd compare this a little bit to Kubernetes services. I just also call out like Kubernetes services are a little bit better off because they can't get these conflicts. The FQDN has the namespace inlined, and the cluster VIPs are, they reject them in the API server, a liberty that we can't really assume. So we could have VIP conflicts if someone, takes down the validating webhook or what have you. So we have a little bit more challenge here. And so kind of just comparing to, what we have today. Classic service entry. Today, they're global. The oldest wins. There's no conflict resolution in classic sidecar. We're inconsistent about how we handle conflicts between kube services and service entries. There's no way to RBAC people from globally breaking traffic. This last one's just kind of the same as kube services. And so, yeah, we can compare this to a Kubernetes service, which is very similar in that their VIPs are global and their hosts are global, but we can't get those conflicts by nature of how kube services are constructed. So we're a little bit better off. But there are still things we can lean into here. My favorite idea is to make service entries namespaced. And so the natural question would be, okay, if it's still a valid use case to access them across namespaces, how do we do that in ambient? And so we can lean into some prior art here on multi-cluster services and kind of have proper import-export semantics. Just like multi-cluster services, you have a service import and a service export. This is just a refresher for anyone who hasn't seen multi-cluster services in Kubernetes. But we could do pretty much the same thing. And in fact, we already have the export to field. In Istio, this could look something like this. We bring export to ambient, but we change the default behavior. It's not exported without a requisite import. And then we need some kind of new import from field that allows us to explicitly try to take things across namespaces. So that's the first idea or proposal, to make service entries namespaced and then explicitly ask for that export. If we do this behavior, we have host conflicts, which I'd like to just resolve with an oldest wins, just to be consistent with the older behavior, and be consistent no matter who the client is. We could also explore massaging the host, but I think this is a bigger change. It's kind of inspired by multi-cluster host names. The doc is available if anyone wants to jump into that. The last thing I'll call out is, and I don't know if this is a valid use case, I'd love to hear, but is there a use case for people like administrators wanting to set like a default service entry cluster wide? If so, I've detailed some options we have here as well, for the namespace model, but it remains to be seen to me if this is even something we need to support or people are doing today. I would love to hear. But let's say if I had a service entry or a host that I wanted to, as an administrator, like force everyone to pick up, the way I see we could do that is we need either a new CRD to export, and the reason we need this is to have RBAC that explicitly only allows admins access to this, right? Because service entries are for everybody, so only admins can export theirs. And if we do that, then we can assume on conflict that ours is more important because we are administrators. There's no need to import these. So either a new CRD, which is my favorite option, or we could do some kind of special casing, like if you're an admin only has RBAC to Istio system. Therefore, this export to is global, and we have to fix a workload selector issue and select everywhere. The nice thing about this is that there's actually no new API changes. We just kind of change the semantics, but the shape is the same. But I still don't like it because there's some magic. The next is a summary. I kind of went quickly, but to recap, the issue that I'm calling out is that service entries are a little dangerous. They're kind of a foot gun in that they're global, and that people that I can't stop can go ahead and change my traffic routing and break my traffic. And given that, as I understand, there's an appetite in Ambient to change APIs, I'd like to change it and fix this problem. My favorite solution is to have clear ownership and tenancy by way of making service entries namespaced. If we want to, we would need to support import and export semantics to expose them across namespaces in a safe manner. And then if and when we decide there's an admin tenant model, we can support that by eventually adding a new CRD is my proposal. So I went quickly. I know that there's a lot of information here. I will pause here for any initial thoughts and questions. I know we have 3 topics today as well, but I wanted to get the conversation started. Yeah. Okay. Lynn, I think we've already spoken. Maybe Keith should go first then.
Yeah, sounds good. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the doc, Kevin. This is really compelling. It seems very much to me that service entry is broken as it stands today. I guess from where I sit processing this, it feels like from the high level decisions of how to move forward, there's at least some of it that's decided for us, just from an API perspective. Service entry is a namespace Kubernetes resource. And the fact that a namespace Kubernetes resource can have global impacts on the control plane feels much like a broken behavior. And so that, I think I'm with Kevin, where I feel like that's the kind of the most obvious way forward. The kind of the impact of doing that, it's not an API change, but it's definitely a behavioral change that will break clusters. And so I think we have maybe a couple of ways to handle that. But yeah, I think for both classic Istio and Ambient, something needs to change when it comes to service entry.
Yeah.
Just a question. Why do we break clusters today?
The proposal for breaking clusters today is that I can break existing traffic even in sidecar. The example I gave was I'm in namespace 1, I'm going to google.com. That's great. Some tenant in namespace 2 that I don't control creates a service entry for google.com, and now my traffic goes to this random VIP.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I thought Keith said that this proposed change will break clusters.
I think people are depending on the global nature of service entries today, and if we add support for import and export, they're going to need to proactively import things.
Yeah.
And so that is going to break their traffic because they need to explicitly call that out.
Right, yeah. So today it only supports export too, right? But there's no semantic for import. So user would have to make sure they update their imports, else it's broken.
Yeah, not only that, but export to if it's absence. I believe the current default behavior is to export everywhere. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. So at that point, we're modifying the default. It's a default change essentially, moving from export to everywhere to export to only this namespace, and that's what would be breaking from an API perspective, or behavioral perspective rather.
Right. And so open question. I mean, I do think it's broken. It's a foot gun. I'd love to change it. I don't know what our appetite is for doing that in sidecar, our deprecation process, things of that sort. I'd love to hear that. And then also the motivator was ambient. Like, since that's net new, I think there's less objection to doing that here. But I'd love to just get like community pulse on those ideas.
I guess the concern would be if user transition from sidecar to ambient, well, there may be a period sidecar and ambient coexist, and it's the same service entry. So how do they think through that? Because if we look at the migration from sidecar to ambient, I do expect there are transition period. Like you might be able to shift 10% of your traffic to ambient pods, the same booking for pods, and also like 90% to sidecar. So there has to be this transition period. And if they are using the service entry, how do we dictate the semantics different for sidecar and ambient?
Can we change the semantics just for beta 2 and leave them as is for beta 1?
That was going to be my suggestion as well, actually. I was just trying to Google and see what the current Kubernetes versioning guidelines are between different versions, but within the same maturity. So alpha 1, can you have breaking changes from alpha 1 to alpha 2 or from beta 1 to beta 2?
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like we have to do something like this, so it knows that this is for the newer API for ambient.
Oh, but you know, there is some issue with that, because right now in Istio, all of our resources are the same across versions. So we don't do any differentiation from version to version.
Yes, that is true. It has to have like additional logic to process that.
Right, either a conversion webhook or something like that. Yeah.
But what I'm hearing is that this is kind of the direction we want to go. Like, there's no objections that are fundamental.
It almost seems like a bug that it was global in the first place. It should have always been namespaced.
I agree. I saw your original comment, Sanjeev. I think, to be fair, kube services are global. Like, their VIPs are global and their host names, their FQDNs are global. So perhaps the only difference is that we can't get conflicts. Like, they have solutions that we don't have that would also be breaks, right? Their FQDNs don't conflict because the namespace is inlined in the host, and their VIPs never conflict because the API server can reject it, and we can't depend on a validating webhook to prevent that. Someone could always skip it. So we need something. So in a way, I feel like it has to be different than kube services because we don't have those cop-outs.
No, kube services are namespaced, right?
Would they only select within a namespace, but their host name is globally reachable now?
Yes, it is.
Yep. The DNS record, and this is one reason why service is kind of annoying. The DNS records created globally for the entire cluster, but like Kevin said, the endpoints are only namespace or namespaced.
No, I think if you want to do multi-tenant DNS, you have to limit your DNS queries to being within your namespace. Kube doesn't stop it, but the notion of a kube service is namespace scoped, except that DNS lookups are not limited to being within your namespace. So you have to enforce additional rules if you want to do DNS lookup, if you want to prevent DNS lookups across namespaces. But the core functionality of CA service is meant to be namespace scoped, and so should service entry.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing and agreeing in different words. I agree.
Crazy question. Assuming that the appetite for adding additional version handling in Istio is not there, what does it look like to like? Do we need a new resource? Like, do we need to? In a hypothetical scenario, just so we're playing this all out, if we, as a community, take the position that service entry is broken, and we don't want to wrangle the versioning issue, is there a path in our community processes to deprecate a beta resource and create something different? Right, 'cause another piece of this is that service entry has been beta for I don't know, feels like it's been at least a year or two, maybe longer. In theory, if we're doing, yeah, everything's been beta forever. If we're doing up or out like this should have been stable, but yeah, it's a really tough call because there are absolutely users who depend on this functionality, who as soon as they upgrade, they're going to be broken. Now, one option is to, if you did want to change it, one option would be to put it behind a feature flag, the new behavior behind a feature flag, and just have it change, and turn that feature flag defaulting to on at some undetermined period, a la what we did in 1.10 for pod IP routing instead of local host routing from Sidecar. Problem with that is that, where's the mechanism, like where's the incentive for us to flip the switch just once it's on? I think that's probably the most, probably the easiest way direction, the easiest way to accomplish it, but not sure how effective it'll be from getting users away from depending on that behavior.
Yeah, I think we have done something similar, like the pod networking behavior that was changed in one of the release. So basically we launched it darkly first, and we write blogs about this upcoming change, how this is going to impact user, and then wait until the next release to enable it by default. We also have Istio analyze to tell people which of their pods going to be impacted by this change. Maybe we should do something like that too. So if we decide this is the right change we want to enable, we have to kind of warn people through our tooling and also through our announcement blogs. Justin, go ahead.
Just more of a general question about people upgrading. Obviously, I think I agree we should add the analyzer, but do we emphasize that people should run that on upgrades regularly?
The analyzer command, yes, we do recommend people to run, so at least they know what things could be flagged.
Okay, and do we know if people do use that?
I don't think we collect stats at the moment, but I do think some people, at least a portion or percentage of people use that.
Okay, good to know. I just want to make sure that it wasn't something that's like, best practice, but no one actually does it, and then we end up breaking people. And so, or do we need to advertise it better? But if we feel like people usually use it, then that's good. Just more curious than anything else.
Yeah, and we also recommend user to use it throughout the cluster, not just for upgrade time, so they can get a lot of saving of their time on resources with the messages and warnings from the analyzer.
Perfect.
Oh yeah, Ian was from T-Mobile, so thank you.
Oh, great. Good to know.
We also have pre-check, which I don't know if that's distinct from analyze or not, but the upgrade docs do say call out using istio x pre-check.
Yeah, that's specifically for migration, I think.
So I do know it's good to get this initial feedback and that there's support. I do think that taking action on this is going to be a multi-week, lots of, it's going to be a lot of work, and we're going to be talking about this for a while if we're going to take action, and it sounds like we're going to. I know we only have an hour and 2 more topics, so perhaps we want to move on to the next one, and we can carry this along in Slack and get John's attention and continue with the folks who have already weighed in here.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's make sure we have good meeting minutes for this too.
Great, sounds good. So next up is Jackie. Last round of reviews for the target ref PR.
Yes, so yeah, this PR has been open, I think, for about 2 weeks now. So I'm just looking for, and it has evolved quite a bit since its initial implementation. So I'm curious just for a final round of looks on the PR, just to get the target ref proto added so we can continue work on the rest of the implementation. Just some notable changes is the proxy config, as originally described in the doc, will no longer have a target ref. And for now, the target ref will only be valid for waypoints and not for ingress gateways due to the complexity and unknowns there. Yeah, I believe those are the main changes. And then we'll also, if a target ref is created in the root namespace, it is assumed that the resource or the waypoint that is applied to is also in that root namespace. We're not restricting anything there. And then differently from workload selectors, that does not mean it will apply to all waypoints if it is in that root namespace. So those are the main changes that have been made from the design doc. So if we could get additional reviews on this, that would be appreciated. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any questions from the community on this particular PR?
So a quick question, Jackie and Keith,
Yes.
Did we reach consensus on would the workload selector remains for a limit period of release and target ref is preferred? I know, Keith, you started a vote on that. I just don't recall, what's the decision on that?
The current, I think the outcome of the vote, in my also my personal opinion, is that we should break when we can, since we make such a point of not doing things in a backwards incompatible way, and things that are beyond alpha. Because Ambient is alpha, we should, kind of train users to expect breaking changes with alpha software. And so for that reason, I was in favor of just letting target ref be the only supported thing for waypoints. For authorization policy specifically, there is an issue with doing that until we can get layer target authorization policy. Layer target authorization policy proposal through, just because we need to know whether this is a global policy or a waypoint specific policy. But that was the outcome of the last conversation.
Okay, cool. So if I hear you correctly, then the workload selector is just temporary because it's only used in alpha for authorization policy.
Correct. So once we get the layer targeting work in for authorization policy, then target off would be the only valid way to target a waypoint. Workload selector would be ignored. For specifically things that are in the application layer in Ambient, just to be completely clear on that.
Yeah, specific for Ambient. Yeah.
Okay, so the authorization policy for layer 4 continue to use workload selector, but layer 7 would use target ref.
Correct, and that's really and
Okay.
so if you see PRs, I think Whitney and Jeremy are working on a couple of PRs. So if you see PRs that still allow workload selector, that's because we don't have the layer target authorization policy stuff done yet to be able to know, is this an L7 policy or a L4 policy? So once we have that, we'll be able to know on validation whether what the target is.
Okay, yeah, that makes the perfect sense. What about the telemetry API, which I saw it has both selector and target ref? Is that and also the WASM one?
For telemetry and WASM, we would just if the workload selector is specifically targeting a waypoint label, like the special magic string waypoint label that we have in alpha, then that just won't take effect. And we'll say, and with HDOCTL analyze, we'll say use the target ref. The more I think about it, though, if it doesn't take it, well, I guess there's no harm in it not taking effect.
Right. That's what I was trying to understand. So is like when I review the PR, it wasn't clear like the selector, workload selector is only for legacy sidecar, or can I apply it to waypoint?
Yeah, so the decision on the doc was for it to only apply to sidecar and like ingress gateways, for example, and that if you're targeting a waypoint specifically, you would need to use a target ref. Because we need to get the API solidified for when we want to do in beta. The behavior for if you do try to use a workload selector instead of a target ref would be that it wouldn't apply, and HDOCTL analyze would tell you. So we're purposely making a breaking API change to use target ref instead of workload selector.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. I think it might be a little bit harder to detect whether you're using the wrong one or the right one.
Yeah, thinking through this again with fresh eyes, and though a breaking API change makes sense from a principle perspective, when you start digging, because I was working with Jeremy, who's writing a lot of the validation code. When you start looking at how you validate this in a validating webhook configuration, you really only have the only thing that we're blocking to formulate it a different way. The only way to really block it is to look for that special magic string, like the waypoint labels that we have now, and to block that at the webhook level, which is fine. Right. But I guess what we're saying is you want to talk to a waypoint, you do a target ref specific to that gateway.
Right, and also we reserve that label for waypoint, and nobody else should be using it. Right,
exactly.
Was there a separate design doc created to describe the validation process?
No, there was not. Yeah, there wasn't.
Because it seems like maybe the proto or the actual definition isn't what necessarily is contentious. It's more so how we validate or verify when each, either the workload of selector or target ref should be used and when it should be applied.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I think that's the case. So yeah, to kind of go back to where we stand, it feels like we have directional agreement on the API, and the questions lie on the how are we going to validate which one that the user is using, and block things we want to that we deem to be invalid configuration. If that's the case, if that's what the contention is, does it make sense to make the API change and then discuss the validation specifics in the validation PR, just so we can know what the open questions are? There is one open question around defaults that I think is important, but it would be great to be able to have the validation discussion in the validation PR, in my opinion. Go ahead, Jenny.
I'm just wondering if also, are we conflating the term validation? I know there's a validation webhook logic, but also recently learned about analyzers, and also the PR that Winnie's working on is doing some blocking as well, right when the policy is about to be applied. So is it really just like validation mechanisms in general that should be talked about in a design doc, or just specifically the validation webhook logic?
I think most of the time validation is generally referring to the validation webhook. There is some level of validation we can do at the proto level, but most of that might end up being duplicated in the webhook at the webhook level anyway, right?
Yeah, the other thing I would add also, like Istio Cato analyze. So because the fact is the user might already have their WASM plugin resource deployed, right? So it might already be on their system. So I'm thinking loud here, what are the scenarios they might be using Sidecar today with WASM plugin resource, for example, and then if they move to Ambient, when they have pods without Sidecar, right? If they need to move to this waypoint model, how are we going to alert them? Because essentially what I'm looking at is every single resource needs rework, right? All the resources in your PR, WASM and OSCE policy, and I think there is telemetry also. That means whatever they have today for Sidecar, they have to make a change for it to work. So we have to think through how do we alert user on these, because it's effectively, my understanding is everything would be broken when they move to Ambient.
Right. I think that's all correct. For beta scope, it's not the coexistence, it's the migration path.
I understand that, but we will get to there one day, right? So it's about
agree.
API, yeah.
Yeah, it's not just a question about coexistence. It's about how does user get from Sidecar to Ambient, and so we need to be cognizant of what their changes necessary there are. Yeah, I was talking to John about something similar where this is kind of a fundamental change where even though routes still apply to services, the policies are now applying to waypoints as a gateway. So it's kind of like a gateway-ification of our policies in Istio. Just the whole point of Target Ref, right, is to align more with the gateway API. But one of the consequences of that is a shift where in Istio, policies apply to specifically, or policies apply to the workloads or the services themselves. But now with Gateway API and with Ambient, policies apply at one resource, at a waypoint. And so because of that fundamental shift, there is some migration work necessary for customers in order for that to work. Yeah, Lynn, that's a really good point. I need to do some more thinking about that.
By the way, I just want to share this one thing. I don't know if Zhonghu reached out to you. He reached out to me a few days ago. Like he didn't really like the fact that we're removing workload selector support and change to target ref. So he said he'll talk to John about it. That got me thinking about, how this works with existing sidecar where people are already familiar with workload selector and everything.
Okay, yeah, he hasn't reached out to me, but that's good feedback. Yeah, I did see he had a comment in the original design doc, but yeah, we'd be happy to have a conversation about that. To see, yeah, I guess I was under the impression that this was kind of a direction that we knew we wanted to move community-wide, and from the Ambient API stuff that you and John wrote, Lynn. But it sounds, I don't know, maybe I think I'm sort of getting the impression that there are, when we start doing the implementation, that there might be some trade-offs that maybe folks aren't comfortable with. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, probably particularly for folks familiar with sidecars today, yes.
Okay. In that case, and I've got Sanjeev's got a topic here. I want to see the floor to him in a second. But yeah, I think that it probably makes sense to have a discussion, kind of go back to first principles about the target ref move and evaluate and evaluate the need now that we have spent the time moving towards implementation. We have a better idea of what the trade-offs are.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, yeah, I'll put a agenda topic on for next time.
All right, thank you. Sanjay, you are up next. Sanjeev, sorry.
Sure. So I'm just FYI, so I'm new to the community, so I'll probably have a few basic things. So pardon me if something's very elementary, but I'm helping out with some documentation, and I want to run by a few things with the group here, and those include some embedded questions as well. So the first thing is I spoke with John and Lynn, and we agreed on the following plan for some documentation. Let me share my screen. You seeing my screen yet?
Not yet.
No.
Maybe you should stop sharing. Okay.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's pending.
Okay, so the first point was to have a series of user guides. So this is just sort of the work in progress page here. So ambient documentation currently is under this operations tab of istio.io. So the thought so far is to have this user guides. Some of these other guides also need to be updated, but I'm talking specifically about this one right now. And these, based on input from John and Lynn as well, was to be a series of user journeys, right? So the first one I started on was Z-tunnel and L4 networking. And we could add more guides here on L7 networking, maybe something specifically on other topics, authorization, multi-cluster, and so on. And then within that, to structure the document as a kind of user journey, almost like setting it up and using it and monitoring it and so on. So the first question is that, are we okay with this? I just want to run it by the community here. This approach is reasonable to everyone in terms of having these user guides and then having subtopics within those and then structuring those guides as user journeys. Is that a fair way to document these user guides? Any objections or questions? And I'll go into some more details later, but I want to just get agreement that this is how we could set up the ambient documentation through this user guide section and then separate sub-guides within each of those.
Makes sense to me.
Okay, so then I'll continue to working on this way. Now I want to go into some specific zTunnel topics, and for that I want to show some diagrams to ask some specific points here. So the first thing is just to be clear on the current feature constraints of Istio Ambient, and this is a kind of initial working list I made. Let me know if this makes sense, right? So if we document the currently unsupported features, firstly, Istio multi-cluster is not supported in ambient mode. Neither are non-Kubernetes workloads or even Windows and non-Linux compute nodes, of course. And then the CNI support is also limited. There's a limited set of CNI supported, and for those CNIs which are supported, there are some feature limitations. So it seems to me, correct me if I'm mistaken here, as a general rule, Ambient Mesh only supports CNI plugins that are based on the Linux networking data path, right? So CNI plugins that are based on alternate data planes like OVS or a completely separate eBPF data path are currently not supported, which includes things like Tanzu, NSX, and Red Hat OpenShift. So is that fair to say that, I know we have a CNI characterization effort here, but this is a section that I was planning to put into the user guide. So I want to make sure my understanding is correct on the current restrictions of ambient, especially for the beta release, that we would only support, currently we are only supporting CNI plugins that essentially are based on the Linux networking data path, because we are using IP tables to redirect from the Linux data path and so on. But if the CNI itself was having an alternate data path, such as OVS, that currently is not supported with ambient. Okay. The second thing is that for those CNI plugins that are supported, there are constraints on certain feature combinations. For example, Kubernetes network policy and Kubernetes service load balancing may not function as expected in the presence of ambient. However, functionally equivalent behavior may be achieved via the Istio APIs. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I'm welcoming your inputs and comments whether this is a reasonable list of constraints to document for the first release. And then finally, it seems like we want to explicitly certify which combinations of ambient and which CNI plugins are explicitly certified, and is it a supported combination, or what are the feature constraints for a particular combination of ambient and CNI? Any comments on this? Is this the right set of constraints for the beta release?
I think it might be a little bit too early to document this for beta, because I know last time from a meeting I missed, John signed up to looking at some of the CNI integration work. The current list certainly is not very great. So I'm not sure if we want to elaborate into great details other than just mention a high level, a lot of the stuff are not supported.
Okay.
I think in general, network policy are not enforced, and then only certain CNI are supported. So we probably just list a few ones that we tested.
Okay. But internally, regardless of what we document, are this technically accurate statements in this slide, or am I missing something?
To the best of my understanding, that's accurate. Like I said, the alpha warning banner currently says if it's a CNI that doesn't use VEST, it's not supported. That is still true at this current time. Yeah.
Okay.
And that might be a better way to phrase it, because then that implies all the other ones you have there wouldn't work. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and honestly, I like what you point out, Ben. I don't know if we want to say more than that at this moment.
Sure. Okay. So I'll be updating the PR and I'll invite comments, so you can provide your comments on what's the appropriate verbiage and how much detail we want to put or not put. But this is just some content that I want to put into the user guides at with the appropriate wording. The second thing is I'm just sort of drawing some data plane diagrams, partly for documentation, partly for my own understanding. So I just want to run this by to see if this is accurate. So firstly, in terms of sort of the current IP tables redirect data path, right? So is this fair? Like, so you have a pack, and I'm trying to capture two things here. One is what's happening in the pod network namespace and what's happening in the host network namespace, and then also what is in the user context and what's in the kernel context. So when a pod is sending, traffic or, making a socket call, it's eventually coming out of the pod on a vETH. And now at this point, we're in the host network namespace, and also in the kernel context. So we're going through this istio out device, getting hairpinned around, going through the Geneve tunnel into the Z tunnel pod. Again, stripped of the Geneve tunnel, going through HBone and cap, coming back out istio out again, p istio out, and then going out the host to an external traffic. Is this accurate?
The HBone in cap would be happening in user space, I'm fairly certain.
Yeah, so that was my question. I was suspecting that. So actually, this is popping up into user context here in order to get the HBone in cap.
Yeah.
Do we, just for my own understanding, do we intend to have an optimized version that can do it entirely in kernel context?
We think that's going to be difficult because HBone is HTTP connect over MTLS, and those are both fairly hard to do in the kernel.
Okay, so is it fair to have a diagram like this in the user guide? It'll kind of give a visual, and then that.
I don't know if we. I think this is the current, like, going through a Geneve tunnel is kind of an abomination. I think there's a hope that we will clean this up and have a cleaner path. I don't know if this belongs in a user guide, but it feels like a lot of.
I think what might be useful is something like what you've got here, where it's just kernel, it's just a host net namespace, pod net namespace, and then just arrow showing at where things go between those two, and then you just drop the Geneve, the SDO in out details. But basically saying, like, look, the traffic starts in the pod network namespace, it goes up to the host network namespace. At that point, we grab it, send it into Z tunnel. Z tunnel does stuff, and then it goes back out into the host net namespace, and then back into the pod or whatever. Yeah. So like just like that 2-level, like host namespace, pod namespace, where does stuff go and when does it move from one to the other? That might be good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The context was to, user guide typically has monitoring and troubleshooting, and if you want to trace where the packet is going, some visual, and then then you can point to, okay, look at this point or look at that point. That tends to be useful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point. The challenge, though, right now on the Istio projects is only like a few people, probably less than 5, who can debug this flow. So we don't want any of our users to debugging, really, because we'd rather they, reach out to the community or maybe lean on a vendor, because it's very complicated. And I agree with Justin. I think I also mentioned that in the chat, this is super complicated to illustrate for the user. We need to, if we want to provide some diagram like this, I think we want to abstract it out, like Ben mentioned.
I also would say that, like, the Geneve tunnel, the eBPF stuff, like, this is all subject to change in the future to some degree, like the actual implementation details. So again, I agree. It'd be better to keep those out of the diagram we do and kind of just do broad strokes.
Yeah, I think it will change, and it probably will also change, like, depending on the CNI that someone's using.
Correct. That too. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So just one thing going back to this thing is I'm open to making some of these OVS-based CNIs or some of the other alternatives work with Ambient. So if somebody's already working on it, let me know and we can sync up and we can look at what it takes. Are there separate teams already working on sort of making Ambient work with different CNIs? And in particular, like OpenShift and things like that?
I don't know of any community
Yeah, nobody. I don't think anybody's working on OpenShift, right? John volunteered to do Cilium, I think. There's some OKRs for that, but OpenShift I don't think is getting special attention right now. That's correct.
Okay, so maybe I can help with that. But that was also the purpose of these diagrams, to clearly understand what's happening right now, so that when we try to make it work with other CNIs, we know exactly where the packets are flowing in order to help us make it work with other CNIs. And then finally, the last point I wanted to, again, sort of similar, but
I think Keith had a hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think even though I agree with the feedback that, this really makes sense for a user-facing guide, I think this is exactly the kind of thing we want to encapsulate in architecture documents, so that it's referenceable and you can change it in the PR over time and see how the evolution of the implementation details change. So we've got a architecture directory in GitHub. This would be really great to have this image and other stuff here in this directory for folks to reference.
Yes, totally. I agree that would be a great place. So we just no need to surface this detail to our user. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Happy to find the right place for it, so that it helps people who are, making other CNIs work, and new people to the community can better understand the data path and make improvements. And by the way, if there's somebody that I have some follow-up questions, can I reach out to any of you guys? Because some of these I can put it on the Slack channel, but there may be a lot of detail here which may be better served by a one-on-one discussion offline. So who could I reach out to kind of get into the details of this data path and so on?
Can we just do a thread on ambient dev, because other people might be interested?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
This is actually more of a topic for office hours. That's why I was looking forward to the office hours getting started. They haven't. That's why I'm bringing it to this meeting, because this was the only other meeting. But really, this is an office hours kind of a discussion. Anyway, the last point, I know we're at the end of the time, so I'll just very briefly mention. Again, this is sort of on the same points as the previous picture, but looking at it a slightly different way. That if you look at the CNI data paths, this sort of illustrates how we are skipping the CNI data paths, because we are sort of intercepting the packet right at the vETH. Now, if it is, the actual behavior depends on the kind of CNI. If it's an OVS-based CNI, well, that's not even visible to Linux, right? You can't even put an IP tables redirect rule there. So we'll need to think about putting some flows in OVS to kind of redirect it into this ztunnel path. Whereas with an eBPF data path, okay, it is still sort of an extension of a Linux data path. So, so having this helps us plan and as well as test for other CNIs. So the questions is, number one, are all the existing sidecar Istio L4 routing and auth features also implemented in Ambient mode? Can we state that in the docs? That
no, they're not, and they're not intended to be. Only the authorization policy resource.
Okay, because really there is no configurable L4 load balancing in ztunnel at all, right? So you get the round robin load balancing and that's it.
Yes.
Okay. And then the other question is that, is there a desire to implement Kate services within Ambient by either some combination of the CNI and the ztunnel data path, like all these Kate service features like service affinity and traffic policy and endpoint slices, or is that explicitly a non-goal? We really do not need to implement Kate services, either leveraging the CNI or implementing them in ztunnel. So
well,
that
today we implement service. We don't implement 100% of the service spec, but we implement most of it. Like no one really uses service affinity, even though it's there. We don't implement it. We could add it potentially. I think there's a possible future path where we rely on the CNI to do it. But that would be kind of a per CNI implementation. So we'll need some more work there. Personally, I think that these are likely long-term things, but not worth spending any time on right now because they're very low priority and very high cost to implement.
So I think it would be fair to at least state in the documentation that Kubernetes network policy and Kubernetes service features may not work in the presence of ambient, because people shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In the docs, we can definitely just say which features we implement and which ones we don't. That's perfectly fine.
Okay, so I'll have some appropriate summary of this in there, and I'll continue to work with you guys on what's the appropriate information for docs versus internal architecture. Okay, we are past the time, so I'll stop here. Thanks. Feel free to send me any comments you might have. I'll continue updating and then send out the PR for review in a week or so. Still, I'm sure I have plenty more questions, but we're out of time. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for the work, Sanjeev. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I think that's it.